The Oral History Criminology Project, in conjunction with the American Society of Criminology, is pleased to present a conversation with Terence P. Thornberry. It's May 2nd, 2017. We're joined here in his office in College Park, the University of Maryland, where he now sits as, you are distinguished research professor, I believe. In any event, we've got a little bit of a spiel here for those of you who aren't familiar with his work, to give you a rough idea of the arc of his career. Dr. Thornberry began his work at Fordham University, pursuing a BA in sociology, earning that in 1966. From there, he matriculated into the University of Pennsylvania, a famous program in criminology, earning an MA as well as a PhD in the same year in 1971, although the PhD was in sociology, so from crim to sociology. Throughout his career, he's held a number of academic positions. He started off as associate professor at the University of Georgia in sociology, held that position from 1979 to 84. From there, he went on to a professorship in the School of Criminal Justice, another very important program, at the University of Albany from 1984 to 2001, ultimately earning the distinction as research professor at the University of Albany from 2004 to the present day. He's also served as professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado from 2004 to 2009. Currently serves as professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, and has been here since 2009, earning distinguished status, distinguished university professor in 2012, which he retains to this day. He's also held a number of administrative posts. Prior to going to the University of Georgia, he served as assistant director and research associate at the Center for Studies in Criminology and Criminal Law at the University of Pennsylvania from 71 to 79. Also served as director later on in his career at the Research Center in Crime and Delinquency at the University of Georgia from 79 to 84, and the dean of the School of Criminal Justice at the University at Albany. SUNY, Albany, I suppose are interchangeable, 1984 to 1988. More recently, he served as director of a problem behavior program, the Institute of Behavior Program, Institute of Behavioral Science, right. University of Colorado. Hopefully I got that right. It's That's kind of right. A mouthful here. It is. From 2004 to 2009. Along the way, he's picked up on a number of honors and awards and distinctions for his contributions, earning first the Presidential Citation from the American Society of Criminology in 1975, earned the Gavel Award, a certificate of merit from the American Bar Association for an early book, The Criminally Insane. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, offered him the distinction of a Certificate of Appreciation in 1990. In 1995, he was named Fellow of the American Society of Criminology, earned the Justice for Children Award from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in the year 2000, the Michael J. Hindelang Award for the most outstanding contribution to research in criminology for a book on gangs and delinquency in the developmental perspective, a work that in many ways captures an awful lot of what you've been doing with the Rochester study, which we'll get into. Earned the Edwin H. Sutherland Award from the American Society of Criminology in 2008, which is a veritable lifetime achievement award of sorts from the organization. The Celine Wolfgang Distinguished Alumni Award was bestowed by his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, in 2009, and he served as a visiting fellow of the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement from 2010 to the present. Before you begin the process of kind of earning an awful lot of hardware and putting out an awful lot of research, can you give us a little bit of background here in terms of what life was like for you before you went to the University of Fordham? Or Fordham University, I should say.
Fordham University, yeah. Well, I grew up in New York City. My parents were both Irish immigrants. They came to this country in the late 1920s. And I have one sister. We grew up in the middle of New York City, a great place to grow up and learn and to play. And I don't know, I guess we had a very conventional upbringing, a very pleasant one. I've often thought I've been incredibly lucky with my parents and my family, and how helpful and supportive they have always been to me, and how that's helped me still to this day over the years.
Yeah. Was there any inkling at that early point that the crime as an interest or an academic? Was there an academic in the family, or what drew you into the academic orbit ultimately?
No to all of those questions,
Right.
in a sense.
Yeah.
No, I had no interest that I know of in crime or what we now call criminology as growing up. It was foreign to me in a sense. And I sort of stumbled into it as an undergraduate. I went to, as you indicated, I went to Fordham University in New York City. And when I went there, I really had no idea what I was going to major in. And I didn't have any real strong career path in mind. But I went through essentially a Jesuitical education from the time I was a kid. The parish we grew up in was a Jesuit parish, so I was exposed to the Jesuits from first grade on. I went to a Jesuit high school, and there was a very, in those days, was a very comforting and very inclusive environment that supported students who were bright, who worked hard, and were interested, and they provided tremendous opportunities for kids like me. Coming from an immigrant family, my sister and I were the first in our family to go to college. So it was a very supportive environment that led me to Fordham and then on to where I am today.
So how did you get from Fordham to the University of Pennsylvania to study criminology? You kind of crossed the boundary of sociology into criminology.
Right, yeah. Well, as I said, when I got to Fordham, I really wasn't sure what I was going to major in or where I was headed, other than the importance of college education and the opportunities that then afforded. And when I was a freshman, there was a required course for all freshmen in Fordham College that was sort of a combination of sociology and cultural anthropology that tried to open the students' minds up to cultural diversity and different cultural settings and how life unfolds in those different settings. And at the end of freshman year, you had to declare a major, and as I got to that point, I went through I took a history course, English course, and so forth. And I went through all the courses I took, and the one I kept coming back to was this required course in sociology that piqued my interest. It was the 1960s, the beginning of the civil rights movement, beginning of the concern about, Vietnam War was just starting, and there was concern about that. And the focus on social justice and the focus on cultural diversity was very in keeping with whatever little ideology I had growing at the time. So I just enjoyed that course, so I decided to go down that route. And in my second year as a social major, so I had to take introduction to sociology, which makes sense. And it was taught by a fellow named John Martin, who was a criminologist. And I continue to really enjoy the subject matter, to continue to enjoy sociology and the sociological perspective. And at the same time, it was sort of tweaked towards criminology, given John Martin's own interest in criminology and delinquent behavior. And so I kept moving into sociology, but always with sort of a criminology focus and flavor. And then from that point forward, I was sort of hooked and took several courses with him and other criminology courses. And then that eventually, with his guidance, he got me to the University of Pennsylvania.
Wow. So can you give us an idea of what the University of Pennsylvania was like at that point in time? It seemed like there were a couple of really influential scholars working at that university at that time.
Yeah, Penn was quite special at that time. It was clearly the preeminent program in criminology in the country then. Thorsten Selin was still there. He was there for the first 2 years I was a grad student. And then at that time, they had mandatory retirement ages. And he, which was 70, so he retired at the end of my second year as a grad student. And Thorsten has been at Penn since the 1920s. He got his degree there and stayed. And he, along with Sutherland and Merton, Sean McKay, he's one of the founding figures in the field of criminology. And he was just a remarkable scholar and one of the nicest people you can meet. He was very, very warm and very supportive, and it was just great to take classes with him. And then his student, Marvin Wolfgang, was also there, and he too got his degree at Penn. Was one of Celine's students, and then stayed on the faculty. And Marvin obviously was much younger and was sort of at the height of his career in a lot of ways. So Celine and Wolfgang were both there when I got there. Were both still very active scholars and had a very distinct take on social sciences, sociology, and criminology. They were very empirically based. They were very concerned about data, the accuracy of data, empirical research, and just a very strong commitment to excellence in scholarship.
They had a research center?
There was, yeah. There was the Center for Studies in Criminology and Criminal Law.
Okay.
I think the origins of that, I think it was initially funded by the Ford Foundation. And there were a couple of people in the law school that were affiliated with it. Tony Amsterdam being one of the major ones. Yeah. And he and Marvin did, and Celine to some extent, did phenomenal work on the death penalty in those days. And Schwartz, Lou Schwartz. So it was, initially there was some effort to sort of get social sciences and the law together to look at criminological topics. But over the years, the law school emphasis was never particularly strong. And we called it the Crim Center. It was basically a criminology program, criminology center.
Yeah. There were also a number of students at that particular point in time that were ultimately went on to earn quite a bit of fame, if you will, within the field. Can you talk to us about studying alongside of some of the people who you're part of a generation that was really foundational in terms of setting down the mile markers for.
I was. That was one of the great joys of my life, the grad school days. The 5 years I was in grad school might have been the 5 happiest years of my life. I don't know, but I loved it. I had a great time. And as you said, there were lots of good students. Charles Welford, whose office is down the hall at the University of Maryland, and really the founder of this department and the person who built it to its position of preeminence today. Charles was a grad student. He was he was probably like in maybe his 3rd year. I'm not sure. He was there a couple of years before I arrived, and he was actually the teaching assistant in the required theory course I took in my first year. So Charles and I go way back, and it's really, I feel in a sense I've come full circle that, now at the end of our careers, Charles and I are back in the same department, hanging out together. That's great. But Charles was there. Frida Adler, who spent her career at Rutgers University primarily. Frida was in my cohort. Bob Silverman, who was Canadian and went back and was very instrumental in developing a Canadian criminology, that is a criminology focus on Canadian issues and Canadian studies, and it ended up as Dean of Arts and Sciences and then Provost at Queen's University in Kingston, retired a couple of years ago. Satyanshu Mukherjee came from India, and Mook, as we called him, he's the only person I know that has 2 earned master's degrees and 2 earned PhD degrees. He has a set from India and a set from the University of Pennsylvania. And then he moved to, he went to the UN, and then he moved to Australia, where he spent a long, successful career at the Australian National Criminology Institute. I'm not sure that's the name quite right. But Mukherjee was there, Mark Rydell was there, and then in the group behind there was a couple of cohorts behind us. Barry Chrisberg, who for many, many years, Barry was the president of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, and had a major impact not only on juvenile justice research, but also on policy related to the juvenile justice system. Carl Clockers was also at Penn when I was there, did some wonderful earlier work on policing. And then, very sadly, he died at a relatively young age, but he was, his work was very, very good. And I'm sure I'm missing something, but it was a great cohort. We were very close, and it was not at all competitive. It was very collegial, and we worked together. Almost all of us worked at the Crim Center at various times on the Philadelphia birth cohort studies, and that was a very uniting enterprise.
Would you say did Penn have a brand, or did it have what made it so successful in terms of bringing faculty together with students? And
I'm not sure about the brand, other than it was in a sense it was a very Catholic environment.
Yeah. All right.
And that people, Celine and Wolfgang both were very supportive of grad students.
Yeah.
But were not possessive of them in the sense that you had to do what they were doing or something like what they were doing. Yeah. As long as you were doing something interesting and you were working hard and had a respect for scholarship, they were very, very supportive of a wide range of things. Another person I was in grad school with was Graham Newman.
Oh.
And Graham is a distinguished teaching professor at the University of Albany, and he and I were colleagues for 20 years at Albany. And Graham has a very theoretical, historical approach. Sometimes he sort of flirted with radical criminology. That's not how you would describe me. And I remember one time Travis Hershey saying to me, he said, I have to pinch myself when I realize that you and Graham came from the same program. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But it was the type of environment that Celine and Wolfgang fostered and developed. So as long as you were doing good work, you could go your own way.
Okay.
In a sense.
So, could you talk to us a little bit about some of your early work? I suppose you were in graduate school when you began evaluating criminology, the book that you put together with Wolfgang, and then you segued into a research position, and then at Penn, and then you went to the University of Georgia.
Yeah.
Because I noticed a theme here that was much more justice oriented in your early segments, and then you came into the developmental work that really came to sustain the majority of your career?
Well, to some extent. There were a couple of themes that went on in those early years. So as you said, I finished in 1971. Mm-hmm. I stayed as a research associate at Penn until 1979. And that was just a wonderful experience I had because I wasn't teaching. I managed to go through an entire academic career without ever being an assistant professor, which I highly recommend if it's possible. And I got to work on a variety of research projects. But the first one really was the Philadelphia birth cohort studies. So the original cohort study was wrapping up that is, all the data had been collected, a lot of the analysis had been done, was wrapping up when I was a grad student. And so I didn't work very much on that, actually, as a grad student. I worked on it some during the summers when I worked at the Crim Centers. I had a fellowship that I was very fortunate. I had an NDA fellowship that didn't have a work requirement, basically. So I went to school full-time. I could take an extra course and move through the program more rapidly. It was great. And in the summertime, I worked at the Crim Center on the cohort study. So that precursor of developmental criminology was, in my bloodstream from day one. And then when I stayed on as a research associate, we were doing a follow-up to the birth cohort study, where we were interviewing a 10% sample of the initial 10,000. There were roughly 10,000 boys in that initial cohort study. And one of my grad student friends I didn't mention, Al Cardarelli, who's still a very close friend, was doing his dissertation on the part of the data of the cohort study. He had selected a 10% sample for his particular work. And these were days long before IRBs. Al had literally taken all of the files for the 1,000 members in a sample home from the Crim Center, and he was coding other variables, and he took it home and he was working home coding it. And it was incredibly fortunate because the Crim Center was in an off-campus building, a couple of blocks off campus at the time, in what had been a large hotel, and the university had rented the first floor. And one night, that hotel burned to the ground. It was a remarkable story. It was a massive building, and at the time it was a senior citizen home. And a fire started upstairs, and this as I said, very large building burned to the ground, and no one was injured. They got every resident out of that building. I don't know how they ever did it, and the fire was like midnight or 2 in the morning or something. But anyway, no one died. But the Criminology Center was destroyed, and all the files were destroyed. And so the entire 1945 birth cohort data, the paper files were destroyed, except for the 10% sample that Al had at home. And in the coded data, in those days, you had to go to a computing center to run things, and the coded data was at the computing center. So the cohort study survived, in a sense, with coded data, but you couldn't do anything unless you couldn't get another variable. If it hadn't been coded, it was gone, other than the sample. But what we were doing was following that Al's sample up to age 26 and interviewing them, as well as collecting official records. The original study only had official records. And so when I finished, Marvin asked me to stay as the project director for the follow-up study. So I did, and that was eventually published in a book, From Boy to Man, From Delinquency to Crime. And that Bob Feely, I forgot to mention Bob Feely. There were a tremendous number of students in our group there, and Bob was at the center of it, a marvelous scholar, one of the brightest people I've ever worked with. But anyway, so, and Bob also stayed as a research associate. Yeah. So after our PhDs, Bob and I stayed. We worked on the follow-up study, as we called it, and there was several papers from that, and then, as I mentioned, the From Boy to Man book. At the same time, somewhere along the line there, I'm not sure exactly when, NSF came to Wolfgang and asked him to do the Evaluating Criminology project, and the idea was to figure out how to identify the most important and the most influential work in criminology, and from 1945, the post-war beginning of the post-war period when research really began to take off in this country, up to that, it's 1972, but that was just when the project was beginning. So I worked in that project as well. And then there was an independent project I had with a colleague, Joe Jacoby, who was a grad student. And that was a project that led to the book, The Criminally Insane, that the American Bar Association gave us an award for, which was very pleasant. And that project was clearly more of a justice project. But it in some ways it was somewhat of a sidelight, I guess. The issue was that up to that point, the people labeled the criminally insane were held in maximum security mental hospitals under a criminal commitment. And then when the criminal commitment expired, they were evaluated and held on a civil commitment as being dangerous and unfit for release. And the problem was, essentially, these poor guys, if they got into that posture, there was no way out, because they were kept either on a criminal commitment, and when that expired, as I said, they were almost automatically moved to a civil commitment, and they stayed there. They stayed, we demonstrated in the book, they stayed in confinement substantially longer than people in the Pennsylvania prison system who were given life sentences. And in a court, a group at the Penn Law School sued them on due process and equal protection grounds, and a federal court agreed and ordered their release. So now there was a natural experiment. You have these people who would have stayed there until they were either geriatric or dead, all of a sudden being released, most to the community, a few to other mental hospitals. And NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, was very interested in having that evaluated, what happens when you do that. So they contacted Marvin. He was too committed on other projects. He asked me and Joe if we would do it, and we jumped at the opportunity and did it. And it was a companion study in New York State, the Backstrom case. So there were two projects to look at. The answer to the question, what happens, is not much. They were not violent. They were not dangerous. Most of them did fine in the community. Some of them had problems, but mainly because of the length of time they had been incarcerated or confined, that when they got out into the freedom of the community, they floundered because they didn't have the resources to do well in a more open environment. But given services, they did okay. So the answer was there was absolutely no need to do what had been done for decades and decades of locking these guys up.
So how do you get from there to the Rochester Youth Development Study?
You don't. But if you go back to the Philadelphia birth cohort studies, you do.
Okay.
And so in the cohort studies, that was a birth cohort, and Celine and Wolfgang and Filio followed them over time. And a couple of things happen. One is when you follow people over time, you see things differently than you do if you have cross-sectional data. Yeah. And up to the cohort study, that was really the pivotal point in the history of the field, I think. Yeah. Because up to that point, it was a cross-sectional world where we had data in the cross-section about offending and delinquents and comparing delinquents and non-delinquents, but very little understanding of crime over the life course. And that study, among other things, identified this small group of chronic offenders, and everyone got very concerned about who they were and what we do about them and so forth. The prevalence rate was much higher than anyone anticipated, and that's because if you follow people long enough, the prevalence rate can only get higher. So it got larger. But it had a very profound impact on the field. But the difficulty with the cohort study was it was based entirely on official data. So you have great descriptive data, but very little explanatory data. You know, we had school records, and so there's some data from schools about grades or something, but not much, right? And so there was a question then of, well, okay, who, like for example, the chronic offenders, well, who are these guys? You know, what are their characteristics, what are they like? Well, that study can't do a very good job answering that question. Okay? And around that time, my former colleagues from Colorado, the 5 years I spent in Colorado, Del Elliott and David Heisenberg, way back in the 70s, and Susie Agin, started a project called the National Youth Survey. And you know, another very, very famous and influential study in criminology, as you well know. And it was a nationally representative sample of adolescents, and with a lot of interview data over time, and it had collected data about family and schools and peers, neighborhoods, you know, the typical social, psychological types of variables that we collect. The problem the NYS ran into, though, was as a nationally representative sample, you don't have serious chronic violent offenders, right? Because fortunately, that's a rare group, right? So you have a relatively small number. So these are the very early days of what we now call developmental life course criminology, and we have, you know, two pictures of the elephant. We have the very rich descriptive data from the cohort study without explanatory variables, and then we have very, very rich explanatory variables from the National Youth Survey for general delinquency, but not a lot of serious chronic offending. Right? And so, you know, there's something missing, obviously. And what happened was the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP, recognized that and wanted to start a series of longitudinal studies that would have the richness of the interview that you can only get from interview data, but with a sampling that increased the proportion of serious chronic offenders, so you could begin to look at what makes them tick in particular. Okay? And the Rochester study is one of the 3 studies that were funded. So the JJ, as we call it, funded 3 coordinated studies, one in Denver that David Heisinger directed, one in Pittsburgh that Ralph Lober did, and the one in Rochester that I directed. And those 3 studies, at the time when that started, I was at the University of Albany, which is why I was in upstate New York. So we sort of jumped a whole part of my history, but that's okay. So how do we get to the Rochester study from there? Well, it was that early focus on the cohort study and longitudinal studies at Penn, and being the project director for the follow-up study that interviewed that sample and so forth, that you know, led to my interest in offending over the life course, and especially persistent chronic offending, that led to a lot of other things that eventually led to the Rochester study.
Now, those are projects that, at least from the outside looking in here, seem to be relatively indifferent. Might not be quite the right word, but it's not committed to or wedded to any particular theoretical kind of thing. It doesn't have a theoretical identity in a bit of a way. How did you get from? How do you develop sort of a list of things to collect that you go out into the field and get some notion as to what's driving this phenomenon?
In the case of the Rochester study, in particular, well, I think two things. One, you're right. The early work, the Philadelphia work, was not theoretically driven. It was a very descriptive empirical study, and that, in large part, I think, reflects Celine and Wolfgang's orientation, especially Celine's. Celine was very interested in very precise, descriptive material to understand the phenomenon that you're trying to study.
So it's measurement. just measure this?
Measurement.
Okay.
Measurement is very important, and Celine wrote a lot on just on measurement over the years. And before I got to Penn, Celine Wolfgang did the measurement of delinquency book, trying to measure the seriousness of delinquency. So there is a very strong measurement focus in that Penn tradition.
Yeah.
And but to go back to your question. So those early projects weren't very theoretically driven. I agree, and that was not very satisfying to me. I didn't like that part of it anyway, which led me to develop what I published as Interactional Theory.
Yeah.
And that work is a straightforward theoretical offering of saying, and that was published in the 80s.
The 87?
87,
right.
And so I was working on that sort of after I left Penn in 79.
Yeah.
And I was at Georgia during that time period when I was working on that.
Yeah.
And thinking of what I didn't like about the existing theoretical models.
Yeah.
And trying to do something better, whether it's better or not, we'll see in history. But anyway, trying to do that. So when we got to the Rochester study, that was the theoretical orientation that we had. And the National Youth Survey that Dell Elliott and colleagues did was also driven by his theoretical model. So, but that's, what do you, of all the things you can measure, what do you measure, right?
Yeah.
Well, the Rochester study, there were sort of two sources for that. One was interactional theory, and as you know, that looks at a combination of social bonding and social learning theory variables, and they're very core concepts in most social psychological theories of delinquency and criminal behavior. Mapping out the concepts in that theory, expanding on them to include important sub-concepts, generate a lot of the measurement space.
I think what I like about your work is there's an appreciation for the interpretation of any given variable can be interpreted through these various lenses. Right?
Yeah, sure.
So
I mean, I find it funny at times where that people say, well, that concept is in multiple theories.
Right.
Well, true, but oftentimes the theories make opposite predictions about how the concept works. So the theoretical point is the proposition. What does the theoretical proposition say about how is X related to Y, right? Rather than is X important? It's important, but how is it important? It's the theoretical issue. So we want to make sure we could assess the key aspects of interactional theory. That was part of it.
Yeah.
The other part that was very important was I mentioned there were two other projects, Denver and Pittsburgh. And it had something of a funny origin because the three projects had no communication prior to being funded. And the way the solicitation was written by JJ, they were funding up to 5 longitudinal studies that had a particular focus on serious chronic violent offending, delinquency. And part of what you needed to include in the proposal was a recognition that there would be collaborative studies, and how would you collaborate with them? What was our model for collaborating with these other studies? So each of the studies made up their own version of collaboration, and that was part of the peer review process of would that lead to successful collaboration in a sense. And in the end, they funded 3 projects, and we were very, very fortunate. Most times a project gets funded and the agency wants you to be collecting data the next day to get results before they go out of office. Right? And there's this immediate, hubbub. And they gave us a year and a half to to collaborate and to pretest. And I think these three projects have been successful for a long time. A large part of that, I think, is the wisdom of giving us that opportunity to figure out as best we could what to do and how to do it right. So we ended up with somewhere about half of the interviews in the three studies were identical, and then roughly half were more idiosyncratic to my interests, or Ralph's a psychologist, for example, his interests. Right? And so part of the measurement was the three projects, and there was a national advisory board also that met periodically. But the three projects, the staffs really getting together and arguing about what they thought were key variables that you just have to include, right? And here's why you have to include them, and so forth. And then so we included some things we just would not have on our own devices because we weren't familiar enough with them. And each study, I think, very clearly strengthened the others by expanding that range of measures, but in a very thoughtful and systematic way. So that's where the measures come from.
Speaking of expanding, how did you get to the intergenerational aspect of things? Because that seemed to be sort of a leap forward as well.
Yeah, so the Rochester study started with 7th and 8th graders in Rochester, New York. There were 1,000 7th and 8th graders, and we interviewed them every 6 months during the high school years, and then interviewed them annually in the early 20s, and then eventually at ages 29 and 31, that as many of the initial 1,000 as we could continue to find and engage. And the intergenerational study, it started with an anecdote, right? And I'll tell you how the nub of this idea came along. I'm sorry, before I say that, I should say that in the study, we also interviewed the adolescent's parent. So the parent was interviewed from the time the adolescent was 14 until they were 22.
Right. So they're giving delinquency measures too.
And reporting on their perception of the kid's behavior and so forth. So there was a parent and then the adolescent, so there were two generations. Okay? And every summer we had a major debriefing with the interviewers, and we'd all gather in a conference room, and we'd go through the field procedures, we'd go through the interview schedule, what worked, what didn't work, what was problematic, and then begin to make adjustments as we went. And the interviewers were talking about how difficult it was becoming, and this was when they were 16 or so years of age on average, the participants. The interviewers were talking about how difficult it was becoming to track and find some of these adolescent participants. And one of them told a story of looking for a girl in the study who had left her parents' home, had moved across town to her boyfriend's family's home. Right? So the interviewer knew the neighborhood but didn't know where the girl was. So she was over in the neighborhood asking around, trying to find this participant, and there was a couple of guys on the street corner, and she went over and she said, "I'm looking for so-and-so, and she's a 16-year-old girl who's pregnant and living with a boyfriend." And one of the guys in the street corner said, "Could you be more specific?" And we said, I mean, that is such a unique characterization, we said. And so we started looking. Well, it turns out that the Rochester sample, 30% of them were teen parents.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden, there's a third generation coming along and starting at young ages with the parents. Both the boys and the girls in our study were becoming parents at young ages. So I just got curious about that. What are the life chances like for these kids? If they're being born to 16-year-old, 17-year-old kids. And so we started thinking about that third generation, and then it became intriguing. that are they going to be like their parents, going to be different from their parents? We know how 2 generations of those families are operating in a sense. Well, what's the 3rd generation going to be like? And what does our knowledge that we're collecting about the first 2 generations tell us about that 3rd generation? So in 1999, we started the intergenerational study. We submitted a proposal a couple of years earlier to NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, and went through a couple of revisions, as is typical, and then it got funded. So we started the intergenerational work to look at issues of continuity and discontinuity in delinquency and drug use and so forth between the parents and the kids, and the 3rd generation children, and to some extent the grandparents and the grandchildren. We can look at that to some extent. And we're now in year 18 of the intergenerational study, where we have annual assessments of the G3 children, who are now on average, I think it's 19 or 20 years of age. So we enrolled them when they were in year 1, if they were 2 or older, and they were on average age 6 at year 1, and then we keep screening the non-parents, and every time there's a new firstborn child born, we try to enroll them into the study. So the objective is to get all firstborn children of our initial adolescent sample, and we've virtually done that. They're now almost 40-ish. So there may be a few new parents, but very few. And so we not only have we followed that 2nd generation from 14 to 31, we've also followed the G3 children over 18 years.
Wow. As I look out at the work that you've done over the course of your career, I notice a couple different themes here. Please correct the record if I've missed something or if I've misidentified something here. Longitudinal research, developmental work, your interactional theory seem to be, and the methodology. You've offered quite a few methodological pieces that are very important for sort of the field's development. And do you see those as distinct entities, or is there one unifying aspect, do you think, that your career is attempting to kind of satisfy? Is there a question maybe that's driving or motivating what you've done over the breadth of your career?
Well, I think the core question I've always been interested in is why do some people become offenders, and of those who do, why do some of them dabble in it and stop, and why do some of them persist in it? And the more persistent tends to be highly correlated with more serious, more violent. So there's a relatively small. I guess this is the insight from the original cohort study. This is a relatively small group of people that commit lots of offenses, and lots of them are very, very trivial. But among those offenses, there are lots of serious offenses also, right? And where does that come from? Yeah. So I think that's been a consistent question. The other one, the related one though, is I've always been somewhat puzzled by the lack of interest, in a sense, that criminologists have in the consequences of delinquency. And so there's a great focus, understandably a great focus, on why people become offenders. But having become an offender, what does that then do to the person's later development? And that was an early interest of mine and a core aspect of interactional theory, of trying to understand the reciprocal effect of offending and delinquency on other aspects of development. And the intergenerational studies, in a sense, is a particular question about that. So, the question is, if a parent is heavily involved in antisocial behavior during their own childhood and adolescence, does that increase the risk that their children will also be involved in delinquency? during their adolescence, right? And so, in a sense, that's a variant of the question of what are the consequences of a person's delinquency. And one of the potential consequences is that it ripples across to the next generation and impacts the child's own growth and development and likelihood of offending. So, and you do see continuity across the generations in that sense, but it's rather modest, actually. So there's a lot of discontinuity, and that requires explanation also. Well, you know, why aren't they like their parents, right? So I guess I see a central question in the sense of trying to figure out, I guess a little more broadly, how delinquency and crime fits into the life course. You know, how does aspects of development influence it, you know, generate it? But then how does that feed back and generate consequences, typically negative consequences, for the individual, their family, their offspring, and so forth?
A lot of your work actually exists at kind of a couple different crossroads here. And you got the theoretical meeting the empirical, and then there are a number of policy implications. I noticed that you've been on a couple of White House commissions. Presumably, that's to allow for some input and some feedback to kind of shape and hopefully inform better policy. Can you talk to us about sort of working in that kind of space?
Well, it's difficult work. To state the obvious, it's a very political environment, and they're very concerned about.
There seems to be different expectations for if you're interested in policy. These are the incentives, and these are the things that you're concerned about. But as an academic, you're.
Well, you know, it is a policy relevant field we're in, right? And we've learned a lot from the Rochester study. I don't mean that we've informed the field a lot, but you know, we've done a lot of stuff. We've learned a lot about a lot of relationships among variables and so forth. And then that leads to the question: well, what do you do about it? And I'm sort of of two minds about that. One is the Rochester study, in my mind, is a basic science project. It's designed to understand something about the causes of delinquency and its consequences, as I've said. And that's what we know. If we know anything, that's what we know how to do. And our job is to do it as well as we can. And so if it doesn't directly lead into the policy arena, I'm happy with that, because I think, you know, there's only so much there's only so much you can do, and you know, we'll work in that area. But at the same time, you know, if you can begin to influence policy somehow, and there are findings that you think are important to influence policy, then in some ways we have an obligation to try. So the three projects, Denver, Pittsburgh, Rochester, were the preeminent projects in OJJ's portfolio for a long, long time. And so the way we got into policy was whenever important policy issues came up that OJJ was asked to deal with, one of their first responses was to turn to the causes and correlates projects, what we're known as in their world, causes and correlates, right? To turn to the causes and correlates projects and say, what do you know about X, right? And what can you tell us about X? And then sometimes we knew something, and other times we said, well, we can figure it out, and we would begin to work on analyses, and then feed that back to OJJ, and then so I think a lot of our whatever impact we may have had on policy, a lot of it comes through that funding agency, where they're a policy agency, so they would get information from us and then use that. And the White House conferences came through OJJ. That as the White House conferences were organized, they go to the White House goes to the relevant federal agencies and say we're interested in such and such a topic, and then they got us involved in that. And so we presented findings at these two conferences. At that level, I have no idea what impact it had. it's at such an abstract level in a sense.
Yeah.
But in other areas, though, we did a lot of presentations, for example, to the Rochester public school system, where we did our initial sampling. We collected, we have very rich data on child maltreatment. That was one of the themes that we developed. And we worked with both the Monroe County, which is Rochester, and the state Child Protective Services to provide information to them from what we've learned. The gang work, you mentioned the gang book earlier. We did a lot of work on street gangs in the context of the Rochester study. And Denise Gottfriedson and I are finishing up a randomized clinical trial in Philadelphia now that is trying to deal with a gang prevention program. And the impetus for that work came from our findings in the Rochester study.
That was a facilitation model, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that. And then, which in a sense demonstrated that membership in street gangs is really damaging. And one wants to do something about it. And the irony is, you mentioned you were with Mac Klein recently, and Mac was a co-conspirator in this work. But when you turn around, you want to do something with gang members. And when you go to evidence-based programs, there's nothing. The cupboard is bare. And so we were left with the problem, well, then what do you do? And so we worked with the Blueprints program to identify some blueprint models that could be adapted to focus on gangs. And we work with, in particular, functional family therapy. And we're now wrapping up a trial to see if it makes a difference in preventing gang membership in a very intense gang area of Philadelphia.
Wow. A lot of your work has also influenced other disciplines as well. You mentioned the maltreatment. I don't know that most criminologists would think to include that as kind of a factor in the ways in which you folks did necessarily.
Yeah,
is that is that a result of the interdisciplinary nature of kind of what you're?
Yes, and I think that's a good example of those early days of the Rochester study, when we were trying to figure out what was important to measure and why. One of the members of our advisory board was Dante Cicchetti from the University of Rochester, and Dante has spent his life, he's a clinical psychologist, spent his life dealing with trying to prevent maltreatment and treat victims of maltreatment to turn off the consequences of it. And emphasize the importance of child maltreatment as an influence on delinquency and drug use and gangs and so forth. And that was very consistent with the strong family approach that Ralph Lober had. Anyway, we looked into it, and with Dante's help, we're able to collect the maltreatment records. So we have very extensive records on whether any of our participants had been maltreated, and then we looked at if they had, what are the consequences and so forth. And to me, one of the more interesting findings we've had in the course of the study is that most models of maltreatment are developmental models, and they're very concerned about early child development. That the basic model is as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And so they're very concerned about what happens early in life, influencing the course of development and leading to later outcomes. Since we're a longitudinal study, we collected maltreatment data and their official records, so we could go back to birth or not. We collected maltreatment records from birth to age 18, the full course of exposure. And like the early cohort study, we found very high prevalence rates. Well, you follow people long enough, it's going to happen. So 20% of our sample had been maltreated, had an official record of maltreatment. It's a very high rate. But anyway, one of the things we discovered, and it's a very, very consistent finding, is that if you're maltreated during adolescence, it has a much stronger, more negative consequence on later development than if you're maltreated during childhood. We don't entirely know why that's the case. we don't have the data to really provide the mechanism of why that works. But the policy implications are immense, because not all the effort, I shouldn't say it that way, but there's a tremendous bias towards treating and focus on younger victims, and they obviously need all the help they can possibly get, given what they've been through. But there is not an equal emphasis on treating adolescent victims or having programs that are developmentally appropriate for them. And so whenever we talk to the Child Protective Service folks, their immediate response is, yes, you're absolutely right. We see these kids. I mean, we get them. We don't know quite what to do with them, in a sense. And so this work really supports policy development in that arena that you don't get unless you have really long-term data.
You mentioned an interesting finding. I'm wondering if there's one or a contribution or maybe a tangent of your research, a line of your research that you'd like to have mentioned during your toast at your retirement. Which was the one that you look back on in terms of that was a signature thing, and I'm really proud to have put my name on that.
Oh, that's a hard question for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer, actually. I think what I'm perhaps proudest of is that the empirical work we did, and it's almost exclusively for most of my career, the Rochester study.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit prior to that, but mainly the Rochester study, has been theoretically informed.
Yeah.
And we did try to pay attention to theoretical issues about developing interactional theory and life course, and a life course version of interactional theory, of measuring it and testing it properly, and of being very concerned about the rigor and the quality of the data. So it isn't so much one or the other aspect. In a sense, I think what I like best about what we tried to do, for sure, is to try to do all of that, in a sense, because if you have really good measurement and a lousy sample, well, you don't have a good study, and vice versa. So it's the way they fit together, and with a strong conceptual underpinning.
Yeah.
And we tried to do that in various like the gang work or the maltreatment work, or the more general just delinquency life course work. We tried to do that in a way that attended to all those sort of semi-competing aspects of trying to research to put them together so they work.
I've heard that mentioned as kind of the Albany way, in a bit of a way. This rigorous empiricism matched with a commitment to theoretical underpinnings. Could you give us an idea here in terms of the status of interactional theory? If you were to sort of do a taking stock chapter on that, what would you kind of include there in terms of its development, its extensions, its current state, maybe the promises for the future development?
Yeah. Well, it has developed over time. It started out as an adolescent theory, and that's where my focus was at the time when I was developing it, but that did place somewhat narrow boundaries on it in hindsight. So I wish I had been a little more creative and expansive at the beginning, but I wasn't.
Interactional theory really had its centerpiece at Albany. I remember the major volume that was put out by the press. At one particular point in time, it seemed to be the thing that was going to sort of drive theory forward.
Well, I think it was a very early, as I look at it, as I think back on it, it was a very early version of a life course model, where it dealt with different developmental stages. It dealt with, perhaps the centerpiece was dealing with reciprocity, and so much, at that point, the world was still pretty cross-sectional in terms of theory development and testing, and everything was, all the arrows were pointed at delinquency, and that was it. And this said, well, that's important, but delinquency can do a lot of things, in terms of interfering with parent-child relationships, interfering with, developing, changing and developing peer relationships and so forth, and that we need to understand how that works as well, and to understand delinquency more broadly, rather than simply what are some of the precursors of delinquency. And I think it miscasts the strength of some relationships, because part of those correlations are driven by delinquency affecting something else, rather than simply the other way around. So, but anyway, it started that way, and in later work I did with Marv Krohn, there were two pieces that focused more on a more life course perspective, and part of that was because of the intergenerational work, where we were all of a sudden dealing with 2 and 3 and 4 year olds, and trying to figure out, well, what's antisocial behavior for them, and where does it come from, and where does it lead to, and so forth. And so we developed, so the development of the theory was from adolescence, and in an odd way, both earlier and later, because we were dealing with these childhood effects on one hand, but the initial adolescents were then adults, so we began to look at adult issues. So the theory became more of a life course theory, of looking at that. I'm not sure. One other path of developing the theory was the intergenerational influence, because the theory, in a sense, said that adolescent development, both antisocial behaviors and pro-social bonding development, as those things play out during adolescence, that influences, sets the stage for the transition to adulthood and the acquisition of adult roles, and how successful that is. And then that model forms the core conceptual model for the intergenerational study of trying to trace, the central question is, how does a parent's adolescent behavior influence their child's adolescent behavior? So the question is, you're trying to explain how the parent's delinquency influences the child's delinquency, but that's coming 25 years later. So what's the bridge? What's the process that links you across this long, across generations? It's 25 years on average, and so a lot of that had to do with interactional theory's expectations that problematic adolescent development, that is involvement, engrossment, and antisocial behavior, and failure to acquire pro-social skills and social capital, especially the combination of those, sets the individual up for difficult transitions into adulthood, and then that, of course, is likely to provide very poor family environments for the next generation. They don't have the skills, the resources, the abilities to sufficiently help the next generation. And a lot of the empirical work we do in the intergenerational study suggests that those indirect pathways are indeed really important. There's some direct effect of the parent on the child. As I said earlier, it's somewhat modest. But if you trace out some of these more indirect pathways through precocious transitions, through stressors and poverty and disrupted family formation, leading to parenting styles and leading to the child's behavior, there are very clear pathways that have that indirect mediated model.
How do you think the field's reacted to the reciprocity expectation here? Because that does seem to be an identifying aspect of the theory. Do you think they conceive of it as being too complicated?
In part, yeah. I don't think it's.
Is it difficult to test?
It is difficult to test. I mean, I always felt that it wasn't emphasized as much as it should be. Maybe I overemphasized it. That's the other possibility.
Yeah.
But I always felt it wasn't emphasized as much as it should be. In part because it is hard to test. It's hard to identify the models in doing that. So to me, it hasn't influenced the field perhaps as much as I thought it should have.
Yeah.
And in part it does complicate everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that. I understand that.
Yeah.
It complicates everything. But still, if that's part of the causal process, I think
sure.
we need to take it into account. Where I think it has been so influential is I think there's more concern now about the consequences of delinquency and crime than there were when I was starting in my career. So that, in a sense, less the sort of immediate or contemporaneous reciprocal effects. But if you think of it more from a long-term basis, an understanding that adolescent delinquency and gang membership and so forth doesn't start and end in adolescence. It continues to impact the person's development and the next generation's development, and that understanding I think is good.
Can you give us a little bit of an idea here in terms of what developing developmental aspects and theory has been like? Because you weren't really working from a blueprint in many different ways. Is that liberating or is it disconcerting? I suppose I could see it either way.
You mean originally?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I ever thought of that. I never.
You never thought of it that way.
Disconcerting or limiting.
Yeah.
I was, but I wasn't very. I wasn't very self-reflective in that sense.
All right.
I did what I did. In a sense.
That's fair enough. Thinking back, is there maybe, thinking of your own development, is there maybe a path or trajectory not taken here? Were there any missed opportunities or papers that you thought were worth writing and things that maybe?
Oh, well, there's always papers.
Yeah.
There's an endless list of those. But
there may not be.
I don't, not in a major way.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things one would do differently, of course, and there's some decisions in the Rochester study I would do differently now in hindsight. But I mean, I think that's inevitable. So I don't think I would do anything. I don't think anything major.
Okay.
I would do really differently.
Thinking about folks who are going to be viewing this in future generations, I guess that'd be G2 here. What would you offer to them in terms of here's how you are conscientious? If you're conscientious, this is how you would map a roadway to success here in this business.
One thing I've often told my students, if you have a low tolerance for ambiguity, you're in the wrong field. And criminology is a very new discipline.
Yeah.
We, if you compare us to, physics or biology, psychology, economics, and so forth, that their roots go way back, and it's sort of hard to trace them in a sense. In criminology, we still talk about Sutherland, Saline, Merton as viable scholars and theorists, and yet Celine was one of my professors.
Right.
It just isn't that long ago, and their works were in the 1930s. So we haven't hit the centennial mark yet, and I'm always amazed at when you ask basic questions about even parts of the crime rate or clearance rates or national level self-report data. We don't have any of that. We have little bits of it. Shouldn't say we don't have any of it. But there's lots of simple descriptive questions we don't know much about in our field, I don't think. The theoretical development is still relatively primitive, and the first generation theories are still with us, still part of what we're doing. And so the good news with that is, if you're interested in this topic area and you take it seriously and theorize or conduct research, there's an infinite number of important questions to ask. I understand that's true in every discipline, but in our area, there's so much basic material that we still need to acquire in terms of theory and methods and data, that there's just a tremendous richness of what one can do and make contributions.
That kind of leads me to another question here in terms of you've done an awful lot of basic research. And I come from a generation in which ICPSR, you go there, you have a dissertation idea, someone else has an indicator that you can use in a dissertation, so you go and find that. Could you tell us about your life as doing basic research and gathering those data points, conceptualizing those variables, going out into the field and meeting with success and as well as failure in terms of the value of that?
Well,
or maybe I'm being a little overly dramatic here in terms of saying it maybe a lost art.
No, I worry about that, actually. This is really expensive work. And no one seems interested in funding it anymore. So, students can go to ICPSR, but at some point, ICPSR has to be replenished. Right? And we're all the early waves of our data are now at ICPSR. We're working on the next wave of data that will be transferred to ICPSR. So the Rochester study is going to be made available through that wonderful archive that they have, the Criminal Justice Data Archive up there. But to go back to the point, it's obvious, original data collection is vital. And we have some of it. I mean, like the victimization survey goes on. We hope it continues to go on. And the BJS collects a lot of important archival data from corrections and so forth. And that's great. But in terms of collecting surveys and longitudinal panel survey data from adolescents, young adults who are involved in crime and so forth, very little of that seems to be going on these days. And I don't see the funding agencies being very interested in that. And I think that's really a problem, because there's lots of, it's not easy work. There's lots of challenges with it in terms of sampling and measurement and so forth. But I think it's vitally important that we continue to gather information along these lines. I mean, if you think of the impact that the internet and social media have on how adolescents behave these days. And if you go to ICPSR, all the data predate that, and that whole arena that's hugely influential in adolescent life is absent. We have a handful of questions about cyberbullying and a few other things in the intergenerational study, but not a great deal. And I don't know how we're going to understand how social media influences delinquency and drug use and so forth without new data collection efforts. And there's lots of anecdotal evidence about cops arresting gang members because they post everything they do on Facebook, right? So that says there's a research question out there somehow, right? And we're not going after it.
Can you give us sort of a 30,000-foot view of how you see the field's progression, the state of the field right now?
Oh, I'm actually optimistic.
Okay.
And so, if I have my own mind look back to when I was a grad student, and look at the field then and now.
Yeah.
Right? And to me, it's vastly different and vastly improved in all sorts of ways. Some of it has to do with basic science, and it's a cross-sectional world. It's no longer a cross-sectional world. We now have much richer data about delinquency and crime across the full life course. There's a whole bunch of new questions we didn't know about. There's a whole bunch of new answers we didn't have at the same time. In terms of policy, the mantra when I was in grad school was nothing works. And there was a couple of famous overviews of prevention and treatment programs that concluded nothing works.
Yeah.
And that led in part, not exclusively, but that contributed to the get tough on crime and lock them up, 3 strikes and you're out, all those policies. Because the response was, well, there's no treatment, there's no rehabilitation, so we have to protect society and lock them up. Now there's evidence-based programs. There's too many categories with very sloppy criteria that list all sorts of things. But there are some really good ones, like the Blueprints program in Colorado, that have very well thought out criteria for saying something works or doesn't work. And then there's evidence that there are prevention and treatment programs that actually work, reduce crime and delinquency, and that save money because they keep people out of confinement. Mainly, that's the big ticket item. Right? So that's strange. In any 2 or 3 year period, I'm a total pessimist. Nothing's ever happening. But you're right. If at the 30,000 foot level, you go back and you look, over the course of a half century, a lot of things have changed, right? And so much of the work on policing that Larry Sherman, David Weisberg, and others are doing didn't exist. Yeah. That we know more and more about. So day to day, it's it can often be kind of down and depressing. But in the arc of the field's development, the education I think is more focused on criminology and criminal justice. Yeah. Hopefully for the better. And research and policy in a lot of ways have changed. Obviously not always for the better.
Sure.
It's a very jagged course, but I think in general in a good way.
Looking forward, are there things that you think the field ought to be addressing itself to? Important questions that need answering, data that needs to be gathered, et cetera. And are there things that you're working on right now that maybe fit into some of that kind of thing?
Well, as I said a few minutes ago, I think there's a crying need for increased data collection. Yeah. In a whole range of areas. Yeah. We've scant data on police killings. And a lot of political resistance to even attempting to collect that information. So it ranges from something very serious and pragmatic and policy related like that to a new set of longitudinal studies that will begin to understand how development is the same as it used to be and how it's changing relative to that. All of that is needed. I don't know how it's going to happen, but one of the things that always perplexes me is that criminological theories never go away.
Yeah.
You try to kill them, you can't. Right? And there's always some proponent that finds something to bring it back up. And so there's a tremendous proliferation of theoretical models, I think. And I'm not sure how valuable that is for structuring the field.
Yeah.
So at some point, I think it can't be, in my mind, forced on the field.
Yeah.
It's sort of at some point there has to be a natural progression as the field develops, where there has to be some agreement about what models aren't working very well, what don't have an adequate empirical support, and then some synthesis of some models that sort of create the next leap forward. And I think that, to me, it's sort of inevitable that it will come.
Right.
Who knows when?
Yeah.
But I think that would be very helpful. The other, I don't see a lot of agreement about what would actually falsify a theory.
Yeah.
To me, there's several theories that a lot of just absolutely central propositions don't receive empirical support, but a couple of other aspects do, and the theory thrives. So I think it has to do with the immaturity of our field. We're very young, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
There's lots of basic things we don't know, and I think it's part and parcel of the development of a new area, new discipline.
I'm wondering how much of that do you think would be due to maybe competing measurements of the same construct? And so if people defining it as, no, you're measuring it the wrong way.
Yeah, right, sure.
Those kinds of debates seem to...
Yeah, sure, yeah. And I mean, there's even simple measurements about if you have a self-reported delinquency measure, should you look at an omnibus measure of and how many things you're involved with, versus other people say, well, no, you only look at a couple of property crimes because they're different than the violent crimes. And so there's very little agreement about those things. And in some ways, that's fine in that there's competition going on, but at the same time, I'm not sure there's a lot of dialogue going on across the competition. So there's just this endless to-do list.
So I suppose with that in mind, concluding question as always is there anything that I failed to ask or overlooked that you think was worthy of having maybe on the record?
Oh, no, this has been very enjoyable, thank you. Well, and we covered a lot of territory.
We did. So we'd like to thank you for your time and look forward to sharing this with our viewers.
Oh, very good. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for ASC to take the lead. I appreciate it.